Okay, today we're going to be learning Yoma Daf Chet. Today's daf is dedicated for Fuash Lema for Bosmat Bat Yardena and Noach Avraham ben Bat Yashem. Okay, before we start, I want to talk about this concept that we discussed yesterday about the tzitz and the interplay between that and Tumahu Trabat Tzibor. I want to make sure it's very clear. And I want to discuss a little bit more in depth this concept of the tzitz and how it works. So we have this concept on the one hand, the Tumahu Trabat Tzibor. Both of them, by the way, come from a similar concept. What they're both really getting at, okay, maybe we'll discuss in a moment, then I'll get to where they're both getting at, but there's this idea that we're not allowed to have impurity in the temple. On the other hand, there's certain cases where it gets overridden or pushed aside or we get forgiveness for it, which is what the tzitz is all about, right? Is saying there's certain situations where even though we don't really want any kind of impurity in the temple, we're going to allow it anyway because there's a conflict of interest, right? We have a public thing going on here and it's timely and we have to do it. And yes, something happened, right? We had the right intentions, we brought it, we did everything right, but then something happened. In certain circumstances, we're going to basically overlook that and say it's okay. And that's the whole big debate. Is it dichuya? Do we say, look, we'll overlook it, but we know it's there. We'll just kind of cover it up. And it's as if we can look as if it's not there, but we know it's kind of there. And therefore, if we have some sort of alternative, we should try to find it. Or do we say it's actually hutra? This is some unique thing that God has allowed us, or the halacha has allowed us to say, well, it's as if it's not there. We take something that's there and we kind of say, well, you know what? This is as if it's really not here. Then we have the issue of the tzitz. Now, the tzitz only comes into play if there's a problem with the tumah. So if you say tumah hu trabat tzibor, then you'll basically say the tzitz doesn't apply to any of those cases because the tzitz is going to come in and say, listen, there was problem. Well, we'll atone for this by having a tzitz. It's kind of, and it sounds a little magical, but there's this concept that, if the Kohen Gadol is wearing this head plate, or maybe not even wearing it, what we saw yesterday, just the head plate being in perfect condition, right, not broken, and the fact that it's in the temple, that already is enough to atone for our sin, which sounds a little bit like magic, oh, it's there or it's on the head, that works. On the other hand, again, it's this concept of this realization that tumah is going to happen. Right? We try to avoid it as best as we can, but in the end, if it happens, it's going to allow for sacrificing of the korbanot, right? It's gonna basically say it's okay. It works anyway. And then there's all debate: is it b'mezid? Is it b'shogeg? Right? We saw that source that said, does it work even if you did it intentionally, or is it only for unintentional? I wanted to read something in the Rambam because I think it's very interesting in terms of how the tzitz works. So the Rambam in Hilchot Biyad HaMikdash in the 4th parak, in Halacha Zayin, he says, and he points out about how the tzitz works and what the tzitz works for. We already said Tumah Trabat Tzibor could be for people and it could be for the meat or the blood or any part of the sacrifice. When it comes to the tzitz, that's not necessarily the case. The Rambam says, "V'chein hatzitz meratzeh al tum'at dvarim hakrevim." It applies specifically to atone for parts that are sacrificed, meaning the meat, the blood. Shne'emal, how do we know? Because it says, "V'hayal metzach Aaron," it's on his forehead. "V'nasa Aaron et avon kodeshim." Kodeshim are what we call the sacrificial parts. Aval eino meratzeh tumat hane'echalim. Doesn't atone for those who are for the parts that are getting eaten. It doesn't help us if you want to eat it, just like we saw about the tumahu trabat tzibor. V'lo al tumat ha'adam shenitma b'tumah yidua. If someone was impure, it will not atone for a person. Only works for the meat. This is different from tumah hutra, right? Tumah d'chuya, that whole heter of b'tzibur. Ela imken ayta tumah d'chuya b'tzibur shatzitz meratzeh alav, right? Unless it was a case where it was tumah d'chuya b'tzibur, then it works for people. But if it didn't have that whole heter of tumah d'chuya b'tzibur, then the tzitz wouldn't work. So now the Even HaEzel says about the Rambam. He says like this. It seems according to the Rambam, there are two dinim. He breaks it down into two. He says it's like this. One is that Okay, that's the basic, right? If there was a sacrifice that was done with impurity, so that will make it appeasable in front of God. The sacrifice will be accepted. But number two, he points out, number two, mashu noseh avana tumah, masha asur lachriv korban b'tumah. There's two things going on. One is there was something that was tameh in the temple, there was sacrifice. That in and of itself is a problem. Number two, there's a sin associated with that. You are not allowed to do that kind of thing. It's forbidden for you to do this, and it comes to atone for your sin. So it comes to atone for two things. One, the meat itself, and two, the sin. And he says it very beautifully. He says, that's where it says, V'nasa Aharon et avon hakodeshim. It doesn't say Nasa Aharon et, tum'at hakodeshim or something like that. It says the sin of the kodeshim. And then he says, and you need both. Why do you need both? Shnei adinim utzrechu. Tibema shenasa Aharon et avon hakodeshim v'nasa al yedei atzitz ki'ilu ein kan avera. Now, right, the fact that it works, and then it's as if there's no sin. Oh, lo yitkasher korban. That might mean there's no sin, but there's still, the korban might not be kasher. It might be you did nothing wrong because the tzitz came in the tone, but you still have the sacrifice that needs sacrificing, and maybe that didn't work because you put something that was disqualified on the altar. So therefore, you need that. Okay, so where are we? Okay, so olo yitkasher korban. Dilevad havara udin davodat tumah bein b'tumah korban bein b'tumah makriv yimechulev. Lachen tzarich v'itzoy atzit sheiratzeh korban. That's one thing. Is it's not enough to say, okay, you didn't do anything wrong. The tzitz will atone, but maybe the sacrifice itself is disqualified. You have to bring a new one. What about the reverse? Nisiat avon gam ken utzrach. Let's say you say, well, God will say the sacrifice is accepted. But what about your sin? So he says, very interestingly, and I thought it was interesting, he connects it. Gam ken utzrach. Dimakom sheyesh avera iafshar shakorban yeratzeh. If you still have a sin, right? If God says, listen, I'll accept the korban, from the sacrifice perspective, it's okay, but you did something wrong, that's an oxymoron. That can't work together. Why? Because it's like mitzvah haba b'avera. He connects it with this idea of this mitzvah haba b'avera, which is a very famous sugya in Lulav HaGazul, about how you can't steal a lulav and then try to use it. That's disgraceful. So if it didn't atone for the sin of the person, then the sacrifice could never really be accepted. There's no such thing as, we'll accept the sacrifice, but you did a sin, because then, right, it was an act that was done together with the sin. And that's why it has this dual element. So it's mechaper on both. I thought it was a very beautiful idea. Now let's get back to our Gemara. So what we're going to start off is with a ping pong. So let's review where we were up to. We had a machloket, Rav Sheshet and Rav Nachman. Is tuma dechuya or is tuma hutra? Those are two amoraim. Then we said, well, in fact, Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda have the exact same debate. And it's mentioned in this debate between them that really is talking about the tzitz and whether it has to be on the forehead of the Kohen Gadol or not in order for it to work. And then based on the discussion between them, it became clear that Rabbi Yehuda holds Tumah Hutra and Rabbi Shimon holds Tumah Dechuya. And that's because of the discussion that they had between them in that Tanaitic source. To which Abaye said, and I brought this on the sheet just to review, to which maybe I'll just bring it up right now. Whoops, that didn't work. Okay, let's try that again. Share screen. No, it's doing the wrong screen. Okay, sorry, not working for me. Okay, so now let's try to do it like this. Sorry, I'm trying to figure out why it's not working. Okay, here we go. So here's our chart from yesterday. Now we have, let me shrink this. Okay, so now we have our chart. We have that Rabbi Shimon said, it doesn't matter if it's on his head or not. Rabbi Yehuda said, it has to be on his head. Then we said, Rabbi Shimon says, Dechuya, Rabbi Yehuda says, Hutra. And then we had Abaye said, B'nishbar hatzitz, everyone agrees, Delo meratzeh. Their whole machloket is Tale b'sichta, if it's hanging on a peg. And then Rabbi Shimon said, Tamid leratzon, right? Tamid's going to be, it's always working because it can't possibly be Tamid on his head. There's no way. He goes to the bathroom, he sleeps. So tamid must be, it always works. And Rabbi Yehuda said, no, al metzach vinasa, because it says when it's on the forehead, that's when it's going to be no savon. Therefore, that's his reason. So here's the verse. And now we're going to darshan what they each do with different parts of the verse. So then we said, what does Rabbi Yehuda do with tamid? And for that, we said, you always have to be touching your tefillin to make sure that you're focused on your tefillin, right? They were going to say, just like you have to focus always on the tzitz. We learn it from the tefillin, just like with the tefillin, right? There was this kal v'chomer. Umatzi, actually, we're going to learn from the tzitz to tefillin. Matzitz, I'll just start from the top of the page. She'ein bo el azkara achat, it only has one mention of God's name, and yet amra Torah al mitzchot tamid, shelo yasiach da'ato mimenu, right? That you can't not think about it. That's what Rabbi Yehuda had learned from tamid. You have to always be thinking about it. Likewise, tefillin sheyesh b'hem azkarot harbeh, al acha kama v'kama, all the more so. I didn't raise at the time, but I'll tell you now that there's a bit of a problem with this. What, the tzitz is less significant than tefillin, right? Wouldn't you think that tzitz is much more sanctified than the tefillin, right? Tefillin, everybody wears. The tzitz was only worn by the Kohen Gadol. So that's a little bit weird. So they say, basically, some explain that we're not talking about the tzitz is more kal, less stringent compared to tefillin. It's that we're focusing just on the mentions of God's name. How many times is God's name mentioned on the tzitz, and how many times is it mentioned in tefillin? And there, obviously, there's a big difference by the mentions of God's name. And it's focused exclusively on that and not necessarily tzitz versus tefillin, because tzitz is clearly more stringent than tefillin in general. So now we're going to do the ping pong. Okay, this is going to be your classic ping pong. Okay, which is, well, if he learns it from there, where does he, right? What does he do with that verse, and where does he learn that halacha from? So the Rabbi Shimon da Amar Tamid Meratzeh. So what does he do with Rabbi Yehuda's pasuk? V'haktiv al metzach v'nasa. It says in the pasuk v'hayal metzach aharon v'nasa, which Rabbi Yehuda used to prove it's on the metzach and it atones only when it's on the metzach. Rabbi Shimon doesn't think that that's the case. So what does he say? Hahu likboa lo makom hu da'ata. It's to tell you al metzach v'nasa. Where does it go on the Kohen Gadol's body? It just has to tell you, where does it go? It goes on his forehead. You'll notice here in the chart that I don't have it there, and you'll see why, because later the Gemara is going to move it. So it was a little tricky to write a chart that involves what the Gemara originally said and what the Gemara eventually said. So you'll see we're going to move it to the words Vahaya al mitzcho. Okay, that's going to change a little. But right now, we think it comes from al metzach v'nasa. So again, al metzach v'nasa, Rabbi Yehuda says, it has to be on his forehead. Rabbi Shimon says that's coming to tell us when he wears it. Where does he wear it? On his forehead, but not that it has to be on his forehead in order to work. The Rabbi Yehuda likboa lo makom enale. So where does Rabbi Yehuda learn that it has to go on his forehead? Because he can't learn it from al metzach v'nasa, because that's teaching us beyond that it has to be on his forehead. But where do we know that it actually goes on his forehead in the beginning? Nafkalemi al mitzcho, because again, in that verse, in the beginning it says, V'hayal metzach Aharon, it's on his forehead. V'nasa Aharon et avon kodeshim, and Aharon will bear the iniquity of the sins, right? It will wipe them out. Asher yivdishu b'nei Yisrael, etc. V'haya al mitzcho tamid, and it will always be on his forehead. So there you have it. It says it a second time. That's to teach you that it's on his forehead and not anywhere else in his body. So wait, Rabbi Shimon can learn that halacha from V'hayal mitzcho, that's just telling you where it is. And then V'hayal metzach would be open to learning something else, to which the Gemara says, Inachinami, you're right. And that's why I move Likboa Lamakom down to V'hayal mitzcho, because in the end, both Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon agree that that's telling you where it's supposed to be. The question is, what do you do with al metzach v'nasa, to which Rabbi Yehuda had said, that teaches you it must be there for it to work. So we're going to say, Ela al mitzcho v'nasa mai avile. So what does Rabbi Shimon do with those words? Amar lach, ra'oi lemetzach meratzeh. Sheino ra'oi lemetzach eino meratzeh. It has to be worthy of or in a good enough condition to go on your forehead. Then, even if it's not on your forehead, it will work. What's this lafuke? To exclude what? Nishbar hatzitz de lo meratzeh. This is basically to tell you the halacha that Abaye said before, which is if it breaks, then it's no good. So he learns that from al metzach, it has to potentially be able to go on your forehead, and then it will work. Ule Rabbi Yehuda. Nishbar hatzitz minale. Where does he get if the tzitz breaks? So nafkale mi metzach mitzcho. He learns that halacha from the fact that at the beginning of the verse, it says Vayal Metzach Aaron, and it doesn't say Vahayal Mitzcho. I'm sorry, no, my mistake. It's from Vahayal Mitzcho. Why does it have the Vav at the end of the pasuk? When it says Vahayal Mitzcho, it could have said Vahayal Ala Metzach. Instead, it says Vahayal Mitzcho. That extra Vav, which doesn't need to be there, comes to teach you if it breaks. Okay, there has to be on his Metzach, meaning it has to be Ra'oi to go on his forehead and not broken. Rabbi Shimon, why doesn't he learn it from there? And then we'll be stuck with, again, what does he do with Al Metzach V'Nasa? So this is the way the ping pong usually ends. Metzach Mitzcho Lo Mashmalei. Oh, he doesn't have that. He doesn't think that Vav is extra, right? Because if you really read the pasuk, it doesn't really make sense. You would have to either say Vayal Metzach Aharon, right? Or Vayal Mitzcho. It doesn't make sense to say Vayal Metzach Tamid. It doesn't really make sense to say it was on forehead. That wouldn't be a good way to write it. Would have to say his forehead, something like that. And therefore that's not extra in order to be darshan. So from here, we got to all the ping pong between the two of them and how they understand that one verse and the different parts of that verse. Our next section is going to be a long section in trying to explain this concept of the Machloket Tanaim. We saw Machloket Tanaim before. Okay, let's start with go back to where we started. We had Rav Nachman and Rav Sheshet. We disagreed about Tuma Hutra, Tuma Dechuya. We then said that Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda have the same machloket. So we're saying it's a machloket Tanaim from before their time, before the Amoraim, even Tanaim debated. Now we're going to show this three-way machloket between Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yossi, and Rabbi Chanina Skana Kohanim. And we're going to say, okay, here come the words, Nema Hane Tnai Kahane Tnai. Maybe the Tanaitic debate between Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda, and obviously the Amoraitic debate between Rav Nachman and Rav Sheshet, is also the source of debate between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yossi in this three-way machloket. So now let's see. And what we're going to do is, okay, you can already see, we're going to bring one option of saying the machloket is based on Tuma Dechuya or Tuma Hutra. Then we're going to reject it. Then we're going to bring a second option to say it actually doesn't have to do with that, it has to do with something else. We're going to reject it. Then we're going to bring a third option. Okay, so we're going to have three possibilities of how to understand this machloket. Only the last one is going to be the one, in which case you'll see we're going to get totally off our topic because we bring this because of Tuma Hutra, Tuma Dechuya. In the end, we're going to say this has nothing to do with it. So let's read the machloket. Titania. Echad ze v'echad ze mazin alav kol shiva mikol chataot shayu sham divrei Rabbi Meir. Echad ze and echad ze is both the Kohen Gadol and Yom Kippurim and the Kohen who burns the Parah Aduma, who we've been discussing from the beginning of the Masechet. Both of them need separation for 7 days. And we already learned that both of them need to get sprinkled every day of those 7 days. We're now going to learn that that's only Rabbi Meir's opinion. Not everybody agrees with that. Everybody agrees that there's some sort of sprinkling. Rabbi Meir says it's both, right? Kol Shiv'ah, all 7 days, from all the Chataot Shayusham. Remember, that's all the Efer Parah Adumas from all the years starting back from Moshe. They take from a mixture of all those and they sprinkle on him from the waters from that. Rabbi Yossi Omer, Ein mazin alav ela shlishi u'shvi'i bilvad. Now, if you remember, why do we do hazaot in general? It's because if someone is tamei lamet, became impure to a dead person, we generally sprinkle the Parah Aduma waters on the 3rd day and the 7th day. Now, in this situation, there's a debate. The whole issue of haza'ah was learned, if you remember, from the Miluim, because they did it on the Miluim, they do it here also. But the assumption is that they do it because of Tum and Tara also. So now we're going to see, what does this have to do with our topic? We'll get there in a minute. Rabbi Chanina Skana Kohanim Omer, right? If we already have both options, either you're going to do it all 7 days or you're going to do it 3 and 7. So what can Rabbi Chanina disagree about? Well, he's going to have a split between the two situations. We talked about Kohen Gadol and Yom Kippurim and the Kohen who is going to burn the Parah Aduma. And we split them, right? We said, until now, we said, oh, they both separate for 7 days. But now he's going to say, when it comes to the sprinkling is different for each. Kohen hasoref et hapara mazin alav kol shiva. Kohen gadol b'yom kippurim ein mazin alav ela shlishi u'shvi'i. The one who burns the Parah Aduma, he needs all 7 days. The one who on Yom Kippur, he only needs 3 and 7. Okay, we're going to put Rabbi Chanina Skana Kohanim aside. Before we put him aside, I just want to remind you who he is. He was a Skan HaKohanim. He was living in the time of the temple. So it's actually usually good to bring his testimony because he was there and he knows better to a certain extent. We don't always hold like him, but it is, and there's certain Tanaim who were known to talk about temple issues, like Rabbi Lezer ben Yaakov and Abba Shaul, and there's a bunch of them who are known that these are the ones who, I think it's Rabbi Shimon HaMitzpeh is called. These are people who were living in that generation that spanned, right? They were both living in the time of the temple and after the time of the temple, and their testimony is usually more reliable, which makes sense. So, okay, so now he says, so my lav, the Gemara says, my lav bakamiflage. What's the root of the machlokah between Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yossi? Why would you eat it every day or only on 3rd and 7th? Rabbi Meir savar tuma dechuyai b'tzibur. Well, why would he need more sprinklings? He must hold tuma is dechuya. It's pushed aside, but it's still there, which means that we want to try to get rid of it as best as we can, even though it's overridden, but it's only overridden and it's still there, and therefore we're going to sprinkle them every day. The Rabbi Yossi savar tuma heteli b'tzibur, right? And he says you only need 3 and 7 because really we override tuma entirely. It's entirely permitted. It's as if it's not there. Now you might say, which is what the Gemara is going to say, if it's overridden entirely and it's hutra, then you shouldn't need sprinkling at all, because sprinkling is to get rid of unnecessary, right, tuma that you have, impurities. So that's why the Gemara rejects this and says, "V'tizbara, do you really think that? Isav Rabbi Yossi heteru b'tzibur haza'ah klal lamali. What on earth do you need haza'ah for then? If there's no tuma because we're doing communal offerings, and therefore the Kohen Gadol could be tamei and it doesn't matter, then you wouldn't need to sprinkle at all. Therefore, we're going to basically reject this and say, everyone agrees tuma is overridden. What's the machloket? Rabbi Meir savar ambrinan tefillah b'zmana mitzvah. Rabbi Yossi savar lo amrinan tefillah b'zmana mitzvah. Okay, you have to make a few jumps and a few explanations. What is tefillah b'zmana mitzvah? Okay, this is something that women might know from the mikvah, that when you're supposed to go to the mikvah the night you're supposed to go that night. You're not supposed to push it off. There's a mitzvah to do it in its appropriate time. Likewise, not just for women going to the mikvah after menstruating, but anyone who goes to the mikvah, there's a concept that tefillah b'zmana mitzvah. You should do it in the exact correct time. What does this have to do? We're not talking about tefillah here. We're talking about sprinkling. So what they say is, just like tefillah b'zmana mitzvah, likewise, haza'ah b'zmana is a mitzvah. Okay, meaning that, now what's the whole issue here? Okay, I'll go down now lower in the page to where I made a little chart of a timeline. Okay, let's just start with this first one. Here, actually, we'll leave the whole thing. Okay, so we have this timeline. The Kohen Gadol separates on the 3rd of Tishrei, right? That way he has 7 days, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 7 days of Prisha. Then he gets to Yom Kippurim on the 10th, he's fine. The question is, when are we concerned that he became Tameh? So theoretically, right, the assumption is if he was Tameh before, he already missed day number 3. So we'd have to be, the first day he could possibly become Tameh was Aleph of Tishrei, the 1st of Tishrei, Rosh Hashanah, right? Which would then mean that the 3rd day, the first day of his Prisha, would be day number 3 of his becoming, impure. So then he would right, because there's basically 7 days after you become impure. So the first day, right, I guess he would probably have become impure the day before. And then his first day would be Aleph, his second day would be Bet, his 3rd day would be Gimel. Okay, if you see, I made them in gray here on the chart. So Gimel is going to be his first day of Prisha, would end up being his 3rd. If, right, this whole idea is maybe he was Tameh. So maybe he became Tameh before. Maybe he became Tameh the day after that, in which case, Bet would be his first day, Bet b'Tishrei. Gimel would be his 2nd day, and Dalet would be his 3rd day. If he became impure the day before he separated, then Gimel would be his first day, Dalet would be his 2nd day, and Hey would be his 3rd day. So now you can understand now why we want to do Hazaot on the first day of a separation, the 2nd day, and the 3rd day, because maybe that's the first day, maybe that's so if you say Tefillah b'zmana mitzvah, and then you make that jump to say not only Tefillah, but also the sprinkling b'zmana as a mitzvah, then you'd have to sprinkle day number 1, 2, and 3, which is Gimel, Dalet, and Hey, and Tishrei. Then, since you have to sprinkle on the 7th day also, well, if your 3rd day was on Gimel, then your 7th day is going to be on Zayin b'Tishrei, which is your 5th day of separation. And then if it was this, right, if Gimel was your second day, then your 7th day is going to end up Chet. And if Gimel was your first day of Tahara, then Tet is going to be your 7th day. So now you're going to end up, if you could see here, you're going to have to sprinkle 6 out of those 7 days. Follow that? So we get Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Zayin, Chet, and Tet, which is where we get to why you have to sprinkle all 7 days. The Gemara is going to come back to this day number 6. Okay, Bab B'Tishrei, which is the 4th day of your separation. It sounds like you really don't need to sprinkle. We're going to get back to that. But right now, we're going to just ignore that. And we're going to say here that we basically have 7 days where you need to be sprinkling because Haza'ab is Mana is a mitzvah. And Rabbi Yossi says, no, you only need to do 3 and 7, right? Which is basically going to be, right, the day He B'Tishrei and Tet B'Tishrei. Because if you were Tameh on, before Aleph or Bet, so it doesn't matter if you do the sprinkling at the right time. As long as you do the last possible time that covers all your bases, then you're fine. Okay, so that's the machloket between them at this point in the Gemara. But now the Gemara is going to say, wait, something about this doesn't make sense. Why? Because what we just said is that Rabbi Yossi holds that Tefillah B'Zmana is not a mitzvah. But we don't, that's not true. Rabbi Yossi lo omrin on Tefillah B'Zmana mitzvah. Wait a minute, Rabbi Yossi doesn't hold that Tefillah B'Zmana mitzvah. We're going to quote you a source where it's clear that Rabbi Yossi holds Tefillah has to be done in the exact right time, which would then mean, according to this logic, well, then Haza'ah would have to be done in the exact right time, in which case they both hold the same thing, and that doesn't make sense here with Rabbi Yossi's opinion. So it can't be that that's the machloket between them. How do we know this? Vahatanya. Now we're on a different topic. It's just going to connect to Tefillah B'Zmana mitzvah. It says in the Braita, Harei shahaya shem katuv al b'saro. If you had God's name written on your hand, let's say, okay, or somewhere on your body, you wrote God's name. Now, why you would do this, I don't know, but if you wrote God's name on yourself, you now have a problem because you're not allowed to erase God's name. So lo your chatz, you can't wash your body because you'll end up erasing God's name. Lo yasuch, you can't put oil on, you might erase God's name. And you can't go into a disgusting place because you have God's name on you. You can't bring God's name into a disgusting place, right? Like a bathroom or a shower room or something like that. What if you now have tefillah of a mitzvah? Now, tefillah b'zmana, mitzvah. So what do? So korech alav gemi v'tovel. What you do is, okay, forget tefillah b'zmana mitzvah, but let's just say you have to tovel, right? So what do? So according to Tanakama, you put like a reed or something covering the name of God. Let's say it's on your wrist. So you wrap something around your wrist and you cover it up, v'tovel, and then you can go in the mikvah. Rabbi Yossi Omer, Yoreh v'tovel kedarko, forget the gemi. Go into the mikvah right away. Ubavad shalei shafshef. Just don't rub your body off. If you dunk in the mikvah for a minute, it won't necessarily wipe out the name of God. If you're underwater and you start rubbing your skin, it'll come off. That's a separate thing. Why would Rabbi Yossi not say, right? Better put a gemi. It'll prevent the name of God from being wiped off. So the Gemara says, Kai Malan, it was explained about this source, this Braita, Dibit Tefillah B'Zmana Mitzvah Kamiflage. The root of the machloket, whether you need this reed to be wrapped around it or not, has to do with, do you hold it Tefillah B'Zmana Mitzvah? The Tanakama Savar lo amrin on Tefillah B'Zmana Mitzvah. Tefillah the right time is not a mitzvah. Therefore, better to go find some sort of something that you can wrap around your hand or your arm or whatever it is, wrap on that part of the body, and then go to the mikvah. We don't care if you push it off. Rabbi Yossi Savar amrin on Tefillah B'Zmana Mitzvah. It's more important to do it in the right time, and therefore we're going to basically say, don't bother with the gemi, just go in the mikvah because it's important. So now what do you see? Obviously, Rabbi Yossi holds Tefillah B'Zmana Mitzvah, so you can't say that that's the machloka between him and Rabbi Meir. So now we're going to go to option number 3. Option number 3 is, okay, now we have Ela de Kule Alma Lahani Tanayim Rinan Tefillah B'Zmana Mitzvah. Both Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yossi clearly hold Tefillah has to happen at the exact time. But notice, our topic here wasn't tefillah. Our topic was sprinkling. Is sprinkling a mitzvah? Remember I said before, if you hold tefillah b'zmana mitzvah, then you're going to hold sprinkling b'zmana as a mitzvah. And that's why you're going to have to do it every single day, because maybe that's its time, or maybe that's its time. We don't know when you became tameh. This is all because maybe you became tameh and we don't even know. if you did, and if you did, we don't know when you did. So therefore, you have to do it every day. To which Rabbi Yossi said, no, you only need to do it 3 and 7. So now our issue is going to be like this. Everybody holds tefillah b'zman mitzvah. But the root of the debate here is Rabbi Meir Savar Makshinan Haza'ah Tefillah. When I said that you make that jump between Haza'ah and Tefillah, if Tefillah is a mitzvah bizmana in its appropriate time, then Haza'ah also has to be done in its appropriate time. That's Rabbi Meir. For Rabbi Yossi Savar Lo Makshinan Haza'ah Tefillah. Those are two separate things. Just because you have to go to the mikveh in the right time doesn't mean you need to be sprinkled in the exact time, and therefore 3 and 7 is sufficient. And again, remember, this is all based on both must agree that tumah dechuyai b'tzibur, and the reason why we're sprinkling the kohen gadol is because we want to avoid a situation that he's tamei. Because even though he can do it if he's tamei, we prefer to avoid it because tumah is dechuyai b'tzibur, and as we said yesterday, that's how we paskin, so it makes sense. The Rabbi Chanina Skana Kohanim. Now we have to get back to his opinion, and his opinion doesn't make sense to a certain extent because who does he hold like? Do we say Makishinan has Haza'ah Tefillah or not? And Imakish has Haza'ah Tefillah, if he holds like Rabbi Meir, that just like Tefillah Bizmana is a mitzvah, also Haza'ah Bizmana mitzvah. Afilu Kohen b'Yom Kippurim nami. Well, then the Kohen on Yom Kippur should have to do it. And Ilo Makish has Haza'ah Tefillah, if you don't make that comparison, Afilu Kohen Asoref et HaPara nami lo. Then also the Kohen who's burning the para also shouldn't need it. In other words, why do you split between these two cases? Either you think you need it every day or you don't need it every day. It should be the same for both. To which the Gemara answers, La'olam lo makish. He really doesn't think that Haza'ah has to be bizmana. And therefore, he really holds like Rabbi Yossi. 3 and 7 is sufficient. However, this we've seen a bunch of times, Kohena soref et hapara mala ba'am. They wanted to do something extra. Again, this is the Prushim trying to prove to the Tzdukim that even though we think it's full Yom can do the para aduma, can burn the para aduma, still, we're very careful about Tum and Tara. Don't think that we don't take this seriously. They don't want people to say, oh, they don't really care about Tum and Tara as relates to this. No, we're very careful about it. And that's why they sprinkle them every single day to make a point, to make a scene, to show this is something we view as very important. Okay, that's the end of that section. This was all to say, can we show other Tanaim who debate Tuma Hutra or Tuma Dechuya? And the answer was no, this machloket has nothing to do with that. Now we're moving on. I'm going to stop sharing for a bit. Kiman az lahaditanu Rabbanit. We're now going to have a braita and say, according to who does this braita go? Okay. Ein bein kohen asoref et hapara lekohen gadol b'yom kippurim. There's no difference between them. Ela shezeh prishato lekdusha. We're talking, by the way, who is it according to of the machloket we just saw between Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yossi, and Rabbi Chanina Skana Kohanim. Ela shezeh, okay, ein bein, sounds like the beginning of Megillah, where there's no difference between this and this, except for this, where there's a whole bunch of Mishnayot, go through all these cases of there's no difference between this and this, except for the following. So there's no difference between the Kohen who burns the para and the Kohen Gadol in Yom Kippurim. Ela, what's the one difference? Shezeh prishato lekdusha, ve'echav hakohanim nogim bo, ve'zeh prishato letara ve'ein echav hakohanim nogim bo. Let's start from the second one. Why do you separate for the para aduma? And this goes back to the beginning of the Masechet. We started with the Kohen Gadol separates for 7 days. And then we said, oh, by the way, this also happens with the Kohen who burns the para aduma. And then the question is, are they the same or different? So how are they? So according to this, the only difference between them is, that the Kohen asoref et hapara is separating for 7 days for purity purposes, to make sure he's pure. He doesn't have any tumah made on him or anything, or any other tumah. And therefore, no other Kohen can come in contact with him, can touch him. Right? It sounds like Corona, right? Stay away from people, don't touch people. Can't touch him at all, because if they touch him, they'll pass on impurity to him. However, when it comes to the Kohen Gadol, let's go backwards now. Why is he separating? To be sanctified. He's about to go into the Kodesh Kodeshim, which no one ever goes into. He's about to kind of meet God. He has to prepare himself mentally, psychologically, religiously, right? He has to get into the frame of mind. He has to be in the right frame of mind. That's for Kedusha purposes. Therefore, Echav HaKohanim Nogim Bo. People can touch him. That has no effect on, right? It's not an issue of purity or impurity. So therefore, that's the main difference between them. So according to this, Rabbi Meir or Rabbi Yossi. This holds either like Rabbi Yossi or Rabbi Meir, because both of them think that there's no difference in terms of the sprinkling either. But but if you Rabbi Chanina Skana Kohanim, there's more differences between them, because you would say it's not just he separates for kedusha and he separates for purity, but it's also that he gets sprinkled every day of the 7 days and he gets sprinkled only 3 and 7. So that would have been added to this list, and then it wouldn't make sense to say ain bein this or that ella this, and therefore that must not hold like Rabbi Chanina Skana Kohanim. Matkifla Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina. Now Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina comes with a question, and he says, this whole thing that we discussed, okay, I'll pull up the screen again. Now I'll need this chart of the days. Okay, we're now going to get to day number 4 and why you sprinkle on day number 4 when you really shouldn't need to, because it's either day number 4 or it's day number 5 or it's day number 6, and you don't need to sprinkle on day number 4, 5, or 6. So Matkefla Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina. Okay, the language is going to sound a little confusing. That's why I put a chart. It's going to be very simple. Bishlama Rishon Shema Shlishi. We understand the first day. Now it's confusing. It sounds Rishon Shlishi. We understand the first day of Prisha, which is Gimel B'Tishrei, that might be your 3rd day, because it could be that your first Aleph Tishrei was your first, Bet was your second, and Gimel was your 3rd. Sheni, we understand your 2nd day of Prisha, which is the 4th of Tishrei. Shema Shlishi, maybe it's your 3rd day, because maybe your first day was the 2nd of the month, and then the 3rd of the month, and then the 4th of the month. Shlishi, Shema Shlishi. Your 3rd day of separation might end up being your 3rd day of having become impure. Chamishi Shema Shvi'i, Shishi Shema Shvi'i, Shvi'i Shema Shvi'i. Okay, this is basically all the gray ones, right, that are bolded here. So the 7th day might be, right, the 7th of Tishrei might be your 7th day if you started on Aleph, if that was your first day of Tahara. The Chet, right, your 8th day, which is the 6th day of separation, might be day number 7, and your 7th day might be day number 7. Okay, so that all works out according to this chart. It's easy to follow with the chart. Ella, Revi, Lama li haza akla, but why on earth would you need to sprinkle on the 4th day? Lo shlishi ika l'sipuke, v'lo b'shvi'i ika l'sipuke. It's definitely not the 3rd or the 7th. There's no way it is, because it would only be the 3rd if you become tamei on day number 3, right? Then Dalet would be your 1st, Hey would be your 2nd, and Vav would be your 3rd. But you can't, because you already separated on that day, so it's not possible. To which the Gemara answers, but wait a minute. I'll counter it with a question, comes the Gemara. And the Gemara says, here's my question. Haza'ah kol shiva mi'ika. You think there's sprinkling every 7 days, but there isn't for all 7 days. No matter what, you're not sprinkling all 7 days. Why is that? Ha'kaim alan haza'ah shvut. Haza'ah, sprinkling, is usher by rabbinic law, because it's like you're fixing someone, right? That's one of the reasons. Ve'eina dochet Shabbat, and it doesn't override Shabbat. So no matter what, you're not sprinkling all 7 days, because you're not going to sprinkle, right? In every 7 days, you're going to have 1 day of Shabbat. So 1 day is going to not be. If that's the case, so why does it say 7 days? So Gita, you're asking why Ein Shvut B'Mikdash, and the Mefreshim asked that question. Very good that you're asking. And they explain, some people explain that there's a whole bunch of things, Isurim associated with this, and because of that, we don't override. There's all different answers given, but it's a very good question, okay? But you can look up the commentaries. There's a whole big discussion about it. Okay, so anyway, now we're going to say, so when it says you sprinkle all 7 days, they don't really mean all 7 days. Shiv alavar mi Shabbat. They mean 7 other than Shabbat. If that's the case, you can also say, Hachanami Shiva levar mi Revi'i. When they said every day of the 7 days, they didn't really mean every day. They meant every day that you need to. 1, 2, and 3, 5, 6, and 7, not 4, and not Shabbat. Okay? That's the way they answer it. So it's kind of saying, sometimes they say all, they don't really mean all, right? We often speak in exaggerated terms, right? We say, right? This goes on in my house all the time, right? You always do this, right? I don't always do it, right? But it's always a big debate. Why do you say I always? It's just the way we speak, right? It's a manner of speaking, even though, right, they don't always, right? Let's say you're assuming someone, you never clear off the dishes. What do you mean? I never, I do it sometimes. I just don't do it all the time, but you don't say never. So it's the same thing here. It's all the days doesn't really mean all the days. Amar Rava now derives another halacha from here. If that's the case, it's a very interesting jump. Hilkach Kohen Gadol b'Yom Kippurim. Dilo b'didan tal yamilta ela b'kfiyah dirachat tal yamilta. Kohen Gadol can't decide which 7 days of the week he wants to separate. It's all based on the calendar, right? Whenever they determined is going to be Rosh Chodesh, that's going to determine which day is going to be Gimel, which day he's going to separate. Okay. And therefore, he doesn't have a choice. And therefore, it doesn't matter what day of the week the third comes out on, the third of Tishrei, that's the day he's going to separate. And then he won't do it on the fourth day of that week, of his separation week. And if Shabbat falls on another day, he won't do it that day. But the Kohen who's burning the para aduma, it's all dependent on him. He can determine what day am I going to do the para aduma. Therefore, we want to be able to maximize the amount of days he's going to be sprinkled. So therefore, plan ahead of time. Have him do it on Wednesday. And then Wednesday will be day number 1. Shabbat will be day number 4. And day number 4 and Shabbat will override. And then he'll end up doing 6 days out of 7 rather than a potential 5 days. Okay, it's a very interesting point he's bringing up, right? This is a similar concept of, let's say, we learned about boat travel. You shouldn't do it 3 days before Shabbat, right? And you shouldn't do elective surgery, for example, 3 days before Shabbat, because you might put yourself in a situation where there's pikuach nefesh. So if you can schedule it, sometimes it's not dependent on you, but if you can, better off scheduling it when you can. If you have no choice, you have no choice, right? That's like the Kohen Gadol and Yom Kippurim, who has no choice. So again, this isn't about Chilul Shabbat. This is about maximizing the amount. But I was just comparing it to there, that it's a similar kind of idea, that when you can, you should plan ahead and think about when Shabbat's going to come out and what the effects of that will be on what you're doing. Again, here it's not a matter of Chilul Shabbat. There it's a matter of Chilul Shabbat, right? If you just come out of surgery, you might need to do things that are usher to do on Shabbat. You'll have no choice at that point. But if you have a choice about when to plan it, so you should schedule it earlier. We'll end with the beginning of a discussion about this Lishkat Parhedrin. Tanya Rabbi Yehuda, or Amar Rabbi Yehuda, it's missing a word here. Was it called the Lishkat Parhedrin? Wasn't it called Lishkat Balvati? Okay, I'll put up on the site today. There's a picture of what the Lishkat Parhedrin looked like. I'm not really sure where they got the details of this from, but there is a picture. So was this Hello Lishkat? I'll just remind you, there's pictures in the Morot Daf Yomi, which are now posted on the portal at Daf Yomi, and they gave us access to it. So I'm going to send the links out every day when there's a picture. They'll be much more useful as we go on with the Avodat Yom Kippurim and the places in the Mikdash, etc. It was called the Lishkat Balvati, which is a word that means noble, important people, not Paradrim, which were not as important people. And we'll see in a minute what that means. Originally, according to this Braita, Rabbi Yehuda says they called it Lishkat Balvati. Because people now buy their way into the kahuna and they're switching it every 12 months. And some people say they even switch the room every 12 months. Everyone rebuilt it to have their name on it. It's like these officers who work for the king, who the king changes them every 12 months. They're not important. They don't have significance. And therefore they started calling it the Lishkat Parhedrin because it was already, and what they're really trying to show is that this is an indicator of, and according to this now, the Mishnah is already telling us in the first Mishnah how corrupt the Kuna Gdolah was at the end of Bayit Sheni, at the end there, right? Originally, they used to be, right? And it's describing the situation. The Kohanim Gdolim were respectable people. Afterwards, they were buying their way in. They were switching every year. Nobody lasted more than a year, either because they died, because they weren't worthy, or because someone else bought the job for the next year. And it was just a constant in, out, in, out, in, out. And we're going to get to tomorrow all these things about how bad things were, why the temple was destroyed, and a whole bunch of agadatot in that vein. We'll stop here because the next thing is really just another mention of Paradrin in a Braita, in a Mishnah, and we're not going to even see the connection yet today. So we'll just start with that tomorrow about bakers and demai and all sorts of other issues that are going to eventually connect to this term Parhedrin. Have a great day, everybody.